Will Geiger, right here. He's just graduated UAS, and he's become a good friend to a lot of us. And he's said to me one time that he's interested in becoming a DAUENHAUERian. You know? And I think that is a really neat thing, a DAUENHAUERian. You know, to consider the specific examples and not just to generically say or generally say that we're following in the footsteps, but to really consider, deeply consider the examples people laid before us. And so I appreciate Will's work. He was adopted by Yeth Hagu of the Khitnachadi, John Hanlon, into their clan. Chefyi was the name that they gave him. And he's also contributed to the Puig. He's stepped up, not just taken the name and you never hear from him again, but he's been there with them. He's been involved in the culture.
Geesh. I'm going to have to stand back here to move through some slides. Shukwa ayah tuasigu iide akhwakahi senget yukhatangi tunakua. Yach sai nakawe ach ish has wushkitan. Has du ani ayah kach sisko has kagwantan. Kach dakanuku chukanedi ka chukan sha. Iide akhwatan kwayinak du ye jene dat. Plachunach yike awe. Ka tlef as Pleinach yeti ka aweho, kunach awe peokne pa shiedehen singit yan watku hastu yukatungi ka hastu yejinei kak du yejinei. So I don't know if that was correct, but I had to try. So Barbara mentioned Richard Dauenhauer's doctoral thesis, and that's actually the main thing I'm going to be talking about. And I need to get going here, otherwise I'm going to go over time.
Do you want to take the turn light down?
Well, can you guys read this, or do you want the light down?
Okay, let's just keep it.
Okay, and I am going to be kind of doing a sort of boring, straight from the paper reading this stuff. Otherwise I won't stay on track. So Richard Dauenhauer is well known as a translator, a historian, a linguist, and a poet. Here I'd like to present him as a decolonial theorist. While he never produced an explicit account or proposal for the decolonization of Tlingit land, his work can be understood as being firmly rooted in a decolonial ethics. Rather than imposing an anti-colonial agenda onto Dauenhauer's work, I wish to develop a logic already implicit in his thought. And the key used in revealing these decolonial undercurrents is taken from the center of one of his important early works, his doctoral thesis, where he develops a unique approach to the study of Tlingit oral tradition. His doctoral thesis, titled Text and Context of Tlingit Oral Tradition, stands as one of his most systematic and sustained theoretical works. And as the title suggests, the fundamental work of the thesis is to analyze Tlingit oral traditions at two levels: that of the text, which is the particular content of what is sung or spoken, and that of the context, the subjective, cultural, and structural relations which form the necessary conditions for any text's production or interpretation. And this is an image straight from his doctoral thesis, but I'm going to move to the same thing, but I just wanted to show the way it looked in the original. And in his work, Dauenhauer introduces his unique approach to the study of Tlingit oral traditions by adopting a theoretical framework he describes as the critical triangle. Rather than advancing a fundamentally new theory, Dauenhauer developed his critical triangle by combining three already established approaches to the study of folklore in an original way. The three approaches are the functional contextual, the oral formulaic, and the structural. As he appealed to these approaches, he is careful to note that each will be modified somewhat and none dogmatically applied. So first, the functional contextual approach. The most basic gesture of this approach is the search for context as well as text, meaning that this approach focuses on the social context within which oral performances take place, as well as the dynamic effects those performances have within the given society. Dauenhauer writes, from the functional contextual approach comes primarily the concern with people. Thus, the context of Tlingit oral traditions is Tlingit people, meaning that particular texts of Tlingit oral tradition cannot be properly understood without reference to the Tlingit social system, especially regarding clan and kinship relations. And that, I think, is one of the most fundamental points that he tries to get across, is that the clan and kinship relations are absolutely necessary if you're going to attempt to understand Tlingit oral traditions. And the function of Tlingit oral traditions is a dialectical movement between texts and their peopled contexts, meaning that Tlingit oral traditions both produce and are produced by the contexts in which they are performed. Thus, attention must be paid to the social contexts within which oral performances are made possible, as well as the relationships and cultural patterns which oral performances create, establish, and reaffirm. The second approach is the oral formulaic. This method focuses its attention onto the text itself, suspending or bracketing the contextual aspects of society, history, or attitude. In this regard, Dauenhauer writes, from the oral formulaic school comes respect for the text itself and a sense for the need for working in the original language with great attention to linguistic detail. For Dauenhauer, the central contributions of this approach are a firm commitment to retaining the full elaborate complexity of the original Tlingit and producing careful stylistic analyses of texts in the form of commentary. And the final approach in the critical triangle is the structural. At the center of the structuralist approach is a distinction between lang and parole. Lang, or language, refers to the synchronic or systematic aspect of language, the abstract system, as Dauenhauer puts it, and parole, or speech, is the unfolding of speech through time, and in Dauenhauer's terms, a given instance of language, an irreversible utterance. And so Dauenhauer's most concise definition of structuralist research, doing research on Tlingit oral traditions, is that the unit must be defined relative to the total system, which means that the full meaning and identity of any discrete unit, which could range from a phoneme to a person all the way up to a clan, is found in the relationship between the unit itself and everything else it is related to in the system. And now, by appropriating the critical triangle and turning it towards Dauenhauer's own work, we can, in a sense, begin to read Dauenhauer from a Dauenhauerian perspective. That is, the critical triangle can be shifted from its original position within the work as the frame through which Dauenhauer interpreted a variety of Tlingit oral texts to a reflexive position in which Dauenhauer's work is read through this very same critical frame. Dauenhauer emphasized the importance of understanding Tlingit social context as a precondition to understanding the full range of Tlingit oral expression. Studying his work today, we can turn this approach around on him and emphasize the importance of the social context within which he articulated this claim. That social context is one which remains deeply entrenched in American colonialism, and I believe this is the necessary background against which to read his work. Dauenhauer writes, from structuralist theory comes the concept of structure as opposed to content, so that in songs and oratory especially, the compositional structure may be defined as uniform, regardless of the images used. From this perspective, performances which do not share the same events, images, or organization at the level of content may in fact share a consistent logic and meaning at the level of structure. Although it is not communicated directly, this deeper logic constitutes an essential aspect of Tlingit oral tradition. This is seen in Dauenhauer's insistence on the necessity of including what he calls the narrative frame as a structural unit of Tlingit oral composition. While the narratives that are told and the clan and kinship relations that are identified by speakers can vary almost infinitely, the process of including these relations as part of the oral composition communicates a consistent and deep paradigmatic aspect of Tlingit oral tradition. And a classic example, or a classic approach in structural analysis, and one which Dauenhauer employs, involves establishing and analyzing an underlying system of what are called binary oppositions. Once these are established, oral performances can be read as the mediation of these oppositions, resolving or at least transforming the tension between the opposing terms. Dauenhauer's second chapter is a case in point, analyzing a narrative song sequence performed by Chagat Peen regarding the clan history of the Tequedi of En Plain. Dauenhauer posits a series of three binary oppositions at the structural level: the living and the dead, the ephemeral and the eternal, and the present and the past. At a thematic or textual level, Dauenhauer writes, the land functions as a mediator in this underlying system of oppositions, and the composition recounts the relationship of people to the land. As a mediator, the land, in a sense, exhausts or transcends the logic of binary opposition, elevating it to a higher level of meaning and importance in the narrative. The land cannot be defined as either present or past. It is both of these terms and a surplus beyond them, simultaneously encompassing, unifying, and surpassing their possibilities. Further, though, the actual performance of the narrative and song has a mediating role in at a social or contextual level as well. Dauenhauer writes, this is to record the way of life of his people before his death carries that knowledge beyond retrieval. Thus, through the act of oral composition itself, the transmission of knowledge about the way of life of his people transcends the opposition between life and death. And while this fails to capture the breadth and complexity of Peen's performance and Dauenhauer's discussion of it, here we can begin to picture how the 3 points of the critical triangle articulate with one another. From the oral formulaic approach, close attention is paid to the text in the original Tlingit, which reveals a complex arrangement of pronouns, verbs, phrases, and stylistic devices. The use of clan names, kinship terms, and pronouns suggests the need for structural analysis of Tlingit social structure. The structuralist approach reveals an underlying system of binary oppositions and a close congruence of literary and social structure. The mediation of structural opposites becomes useful in understanding the functional role played by oral performance in social context. And finally, the functional contextual approach reveals the role the performance plays within its social context and the attitude that the tradition bearer takes towards the entire process. Seeing the triangle come together, it is imperative that we fold in Dauenhauer's critical assertion that the most important aspect is the tradition bearer himself, whose attitudes are put into a text which can be analyzed and are related somehow to a social structure which can also be analyzed. And I don't think it was his intent, but we should also add that this applies to women too. It's not just the tradition bearer himself. But conveniently, if we said this in Tlingit, it wouldn't be gendered. Notice in this statement that the tradition bearer is primary, while theoretical analysis of their work and its social context is a derivative or secondary process. We should also note that the arrangement of the critical triangle combines what Dauenhauer has called the three necessities of Tlingit research: respect for the integrity of the people from the functional contextual approach, respect for the integrity of the text from the oral formulaic approach, and respect for the integrity of the social structure which ties everything together from the structuralist approach. In light of this, as we begin to reflect the critical triangle back towards Dauenhauer's own work, I would suggest that the social function of Dauenhauer's writing is precisely respect itself. Consider the opening of the chapter on Chagat Peen's narrative song sequence, where Dauenhauer writes, "His clan history dispels the idea that pre-literate people do not have the capacity for abstract thought." Here we can distill yet another structural opposition at work, this time beneath Dauenhauer's own text. Dauenhauer maintains the problematic opposition pre-literate-literate precisely in order to mediate and transform its power to structure meaning. When translated into the ideological landscape of colonial America, however, the opposition pre-literate-literate is tied in with a larger system of oppositions, such as pre-literate-literate, simple-complex, savage-civilized, evil-good, dark-light. Dauenhauer's chapter on Chagat Peen, in fact his entire thesis, and many of his other works can be read as attempts to plumb the depths, mediate, and ultimately negate these mythic structures of American colonialism. Indeed, Dauenhauer's first chapter lays out the theoretical architecture that the rest of the thesis relies on, and a peculiar footnote is found at the end of the chapter, which was attached after the thesis was completed. It reads, "A very important theoretical article which became available too late for incorporation is Roland Barthes, An Introduction to the Structural Analysis of Narrative." This footnote makes two distinct contributions. First, it brings the French literary critic Roland Barthes into the conversation. For some people, that's really cool. Second, it opens the door for asking what other texts became available too late for incorporation. Roland Barthes was incorporated as unincorporated. In other words, he is present in the text only potentially, which means that Barthes' other writings can also influence the theoretical lens through which we read Dauenhauer today. And for me, the very important theoretical texts which became available too late for incorporation come from a network of philosophical, critical theoretical, and decolonial thinkers writing from Western and indigenous contexts. With this in mind, reading Dauenhauer is more about creatively harnessing an unexhausted potential within his work than it is about becoming dogmatically committed to the letter of his writings. In a text on revolution, the decolonial feminist Shayla Sandoval writes, "Today, Roland Barthes is rarely understood by academics as a decolonial theorist, as a scholar whose work has contributed to the great world historical movement towards decolonization that marked the 20th century." She adds, "Today, Barthes' groundbreaking work on semiotics can be understood as an important contribution to what has become a compelling worldwide movement towards decolonization." Just as Sandoval brings the specifically decolonial character of Barthes' work to center stage, here I suggest that Dauenhauer can be read in exactly the same way. And while Sandoval locates Barthes' influence firmly in the 20th century, I believe Dauenhauer's work will continue to have a lasting impact on future decolonial thought of the 21st. Let's examine one way in which this is true. In chapter 5 of his dissertation, Dauenhauer opens with a warning. There exists a dangerous misconception that what is called primitive is really primitive at all, and moreover that it is necessarily simple. Indeed, it may only be a reflection of the Western ego that many non-Western traditions are labeled simple. Often, Western man has not cared or taken the time to plumb the depths of non-Western tradition, or has not comprehended it sufficiently. Many popular concepts of non-Western poetic traditions, especially Alaska Native traditions, are based on ignorance and very superficial observation that is ultimately self-fulfilling expectation of prior concepts. In this passage, before beginning the discussion of Tlingit songs, Dauenhauer focuses the reader's attention on Western perceptions of non-Western traditions. Here we see a similar move as was made regarding the supposed simplicity of someone like Agat Peen, only here he adds the critical dimension of the colonial ego and its fantasy formations. The reference to social context made here is one in which the colonizing group is only able to experience non-Western literary expressions as reflections of their own Western egos, that is, as mediated through a colonial fantasy. Dauenhauer also suggests in this passage that Western individuals privilege prior concepts of Alaska Native poetic expressions before their actual embodied performances. These concepts are structured in such a way as to elicit racist attitudes, which reduce Alaska Native literary expressions to the patronizing categories primitive and simple. Thus, it is not simply that Western individuals are lazy interpreters. Not only the political and economic, but also the psychic and symbolic landscapes into which they are born are already structured according to a colonial logic. This colonial logic is genocidal. It is driven towards the essential termination of the Tlingit language, people, and traditions in order to substitute in their void the images carved up by the colonial imagination. And to deepen the perversity of this, the entire process is passed off as a natural and morally consistent state of reality. Here it is important to introduce the decolonial scholar Nelson Maldonado Torres, who separates the terms colonialism and coloniality. Colonialism, he writes, denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation. Coloniality, instead, refers to the long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Colonialism is the structuring force of state sovereignty and capitalist modes of production. Coloniality is a type of attitude and cultural patterns secreted by this colonial system. Maldonado Torres identifies the normative ethical orientation in coloniality to be the naturalization of war, which refers to the radical suspension or displacement of ethical and political relationships in favor of the propagation of a peculiar death ethic that renders massacre and different forms of genocide as natural. Coloniality is thus a non-ethics, a death ethics, in which the colonial projects to terminate the Tlingit language, culture, and political and economic sovereignty are codified into the very substance of social existence and are made to pass off as natural, necessary, sometimes insignificant processes. Rather than advancing a thoroughgoing analysis of the economic and political structures of colonialism, Dauenhauer's work offers a critical response to the aspect of coloniality, as it has come to inform Western attitudes towards the Tlingit language, traditions, and people. Rather than explicitly announcing his commitment to a decolonial ethics within the text, this dimension of Dauenhauer's thought is located at the site of his text's social function within its social context. Its social function is a subversion or an interruption of coloniality's naturalizing hold on individuals. The social context is Tlingit land today, as it is forcibly structured according to capitalism in the American state, where Tlingit language, culture, and epistemology are routinely renounced as having no pragmatic value, and where this entire process is presented as a natural and morally neutral outcome for which no one is presently responsible. This is precisely the contemporary expression of coloniality that continues today as a profound cultural force within what remains a deeply entrenched colonial society. While scholars such as Bart and Maldonado Torres articulate the concept of coloniality in rich theoretical terms, Richard Dauenhauer provides a framework through which to initiate the social process of its cancellation. This especially pertains to outsiders' perceptions of Tlingit people, language, and oral traditions, as they are informed more by the non-ethics and fantasy formations of American coloniality than they are by Tlingit tradition bearers themselves in appropriate social contexts. Of course, the structure, content, and function of the Tlingit texts presented in Dauenhauer's thesis are mediated through Dauenhauer's analysis of them, and his thesis should therefore not be taken as a manual on how to think like a Tlingit elder. Rather, this sort of decolonial mediation of the tradition bearer's words becomes necessary for many when we understand the extent to which the spontaneous attitudes towards them are already mediated through a hostile and reductive colonial framework. Dauenhauer's mediation of the tradition bearer's words through the theoretical concepts and the English language is a means by which to begin shedding the attachments to the psychic and symbolic colonial system. Once this process is initiated, Dauenhauer sets us the task of respectfully studying the Tlingit language and oral traditions by attending to the tradition bearers themselves. The social function of Dauenhauer's work is simultaneously positive and negative. Negatively, it works to cancel or at least suspend coloniality. In more concrete terms, he sought to undermine the attitudes rather than the policies which lead to the naturalization of colonial racism. This is perhaps most apparent in his concerns over education. He forces us to realize that Tlingit knowledge, language, and culture, etc., are not marginalized, refused, or reductively totalized in Alaskan educational systems because they are inherently trivial or serve no meaningful pragmatic purpose. This only occurs because Alaskan education remains colonial in its structure and foundations, while its constituents continue to perpetuate, often unconsciously, a destructive form of coloniality. As such, Alaskan education is predisposed to relate only to its own fantasy formations of Tlingit language and knowledge, rather than Tlingit language and knowledge as they are defined by Tlingit tradition bearers themselves, in the Tlingit language, within Tlingit social and intellectual contexts. This leads into the positive or affirmative aspect of Dauenhauer's work. The negative movement of combating the non-ethics of coloniality already bears within it a positive commitment to building up ethical relations through respect for the Tlingit language, people, and clan system. While Dauenhauer has become the central figure of this presentation, we must reassert his claim that the most important aspect is the tradition bearer himself. Within his thesis, this statement pertains to the schematic layout of the critical triangle. Reading Dauenhauer in light of his implicit decolonial attitude, however, this could be reformulated into a central affirmative thesis of future Dauenhauerian decolonial thought. The most important aspect of decolonial ethics on Tlingit land is respect for the tradition bearers themselves. In this sense, Dauenhauer's notion of respect can be understood as the diametrical opposite of coloniality. Coloniality begins in suspending ethics in favor of racist skepticism. Respect begins in the ethical affirmation of decolonial love and responsibility. To conclude, Dauenhauer's thought shows a thorough commitment to decolonial ethics. He calls us to undermine and refuse the naturalization of colonial racism, and to begin the neglected process of building up ethical social relations founded in his critical notion of respect. Dauenhauer's own expression of this was combating institutional racism in education and unapologetically asserting that the serious and widespread learning of the Tlingit language, while privileging the perspectives of the tradition bearers themselves, is the necessary precondition of shedding our collective attachments to a still operative colonial system. The Dauenhauerian project to be carried on to the future, then, involves establishing and building up ethical attitudes and social relations which refuse to accommodate the colonial, rather than maintaining colonial attitudes and social relations which refuse to accommodate the ethical. Nas chi shawe, ikat yuhan, ach eti sa achi.